Hey, in this edition of Southern Crash Kings, we're doing something different on the channel. So I've got a 2017 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon behind me. This particular Rubicon I just rebuilt. It was a totaled vehicle and I built it from the ground up. Now I know many of you out there have questions about what this process is like to buy a salvage vehicle and rebuild it. How much money can you save? How difficult is it? I will answer those questions. But we do it a little different here at Southern Crash Kings. And one thing that we do differently is, in addition to buying this Wrangler, I bought additional Wranglers, actually 3 more for parts to put this Wrangler back together. Now all those Wranglers, they're stories, and I'll tell you those stories. Stay tuned. All right, so as I said, behind me is a 2017 Jeep Wrangler. And now this Jeep is a Jeep that I have been wanting for a long time and finally had the opportunity to get one. My love for Jeeps, though, specifically the Wranglers, goes all the way back to my childhood. So I remember in the mid-90s, back when the YJs were out, these were leaf spring Wranglers, I got to ride in one for the first time. This thing had about a 4-inch lift, had 35-inch tires, and I just remember thinking, man, that is the coolest vehicle I have ever rode in my life. Now, many of you know, from 86 up to 95, that was the YJ generation. From 96 to 06 was the TJ version. And that was a cool spring Wrangler. So improved the ride. They made the Wranglers a little wider, much better Jeep. And one of my neighbors got one of those brand new, first year, 96 model red. I'll never forget it. And every day I got to see that Wrangler come in and out of the neighborhood thinking, man, I would love to have one of those one day. Now in 07, Wranglers went to the JK model, and they offered 2-door and for the first time a 4-door model. And that model was the one that really caught my attention, that 4-door, because now you can haul your family in it. And it's much more comfortable with those 4 doors and improve the ride with a longer wheelbase also. And so now I was at a point in life where I could afford to get one of these Wranglers. But I don't like to just go buy them off the lot. I like to find the Wrangler, rebuild it, and kind of have some sweat equity in it. And you learn a ton while you're doing it. You know it inside and out, and it's the challenge of it all. Now, when you buy vehicles at the auction that are salvage, a lot of times it can be a very time-consuming process. So the first thing you want to do is set your, what are you wanting? What's your goal? Set some parameters for what you're looking for. So in this case, I wanted a 4-door. I wanted a Rubicon. I didn't really care what transmission it had in it. I would have been fine with the manual or the automatic. I also prefer that the Wrangler I rebuilt have a hardtop already on it, because those are super expensive if you actually needed one of those. And they can be a little tricky to find because a lot of times those roofs get cracked and accidents. I wanted to try to get one low mileage, somewhere 50,000 miles or less. And the color, didn't really care about the color. There was one color I said I did not want though, and it was black. You might be saying that Jeep Wrangler behind you is black. I know. I'll explain in a minute. So now when you bid on these vehicles, you have to have access to a salvage car auction. So if you're not licensed to buy direct, you've got to go through a broker. There's several auctions out there, but the 2 biggest ones are Copart or IAAI. And those you're going to find most of your inventory. Now, when you're looking for these for a salvage vehicle, you want to kind of set up your search for how far you're willing to go get a vehicle. So for me, I set up a parameter of about 500 miles for me. And then the fun begins. So almost daily, you've got to be searching for what vehicles are out there that meet your search criteria. And for me, I was able to filter it down to where for about 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a little over a month, I was bidding on a Wrangler almost every day. Now, why didn't I get one? Well, because I'm not that picky on what I get. I do have some search parameters that I'm trying to find a certain vehicle, but sometimes I just let the vehicle pick me. And most of the time, what determines that is the budget. So you have different values of a vehicle. So if you're in the clean title car world, you've got trade-in value, you might have wholesale value, you might have retail value, you may have a private party value that's somewhere in there. So it's different when you're talking about a totaled vehicle. So with a total vehicle, you have the value of the vehicle before it was wrecked, but now that it's crashed, it's not worth as much. So when you go to these auctions and you try to bid on these vehicles, you're bidding against basically two people. You're bidding against the rebuilders, and you're bidding against the salvage yard guys. And those guys are just buying them for parts. Now, generally, your rebuilding guys will pay a little more for a vehicle than the parts guys. So there's ranges. But for rebuilders, I've seen them go as high as 40 or 50% of retail value at auction. So in other words, if the vehicle retail pre-crash was $30,000, I've seen them go as high as $15,000. Now, that doesn't give you a lot of money to repair it and make money if you want to rebuild it. So what do? I tried to find a vehicle that when it's repaired all in, I have about 50% of retail value in it. And how do you determine how much you're going to buy for at auction? Well, it's different for each vehicle. So as you look at the vehicle, you kind of need to have an idea of how much money you think it would cost to repair that vehicle. And then you can back off of that number of where you want to be once fixed and figure out how much you can pay for that vehicle. Obviously one that just has a fender, maybe some bumper damage, you can pay more for that because you don't need a whole lot of parts. If one's a rollover, you can't pay a lot for that because you got to spend a lot of time and money on that. So for this particular Jeep, I basically said any Wrangler that goes for less than 30% of its pre-crashed value, I'm going to buy. And so at the time I bought this Wrangler, it booked for $36,000, $37,000, give or take. So basically that meant that I could pay somewhere around $10,000 or less for that particular Wrangler. And so there's a lot of demand on these Wranglers. So they kind of go a little outside of what I call normal range when you're building on these. Sometimes they go a little higher. So I had to bid on Wrangler after Wrangler after Wrangler after Wrangler. And I didn't think I was ever going to get one. Now, this particular Wrangler, I actually won it at the live auction, which basically means when the auction is going on, they have different classifications for these vehicles. So some they sell with no reserve, meaning final bid, you get it. Some are on reserve, some are on seller approval. And so this one was on seller approval. All right, so when I saw this Jeep come through the auction, what kind of caught my attention was it looked really, really clean, really good condition. And you could tell from the pictures it was low mileage. And when I looked at the details on the vehicle, I saw it had 29,000 miles on it. Now, I had not been bidding on any Jeeps at that low mileage, really didn't need a Jeep with that low of a mileage, but it fit what I was looking for. It was the Rubicon, had the hard top. It wasn't automatic, but then again, I didn't really care. But just the cleanliness of the vehicle and how good a shape it looked to be in, that caught my attention. So I was like, hey, I'll bid on it. So that day, I was actually bidding on quite a few Wranglers, and I won the auction, the live auction, at $8,600 for this Wrangler. Now, I didn't think much about it because I'd been bidding for weeks, and I saw it was on seller approval. I'm like, nah, if it happens, it happens. No big deal. Go on about my day. Well, about 4 hours later, I was walking through my shop, and my phone buzzes, and I look down, and it says, you have won the Jeep Wrangler. So the seller didn't even counteroffer, just accepted that bid. So I was now the proud owner of a Jeep Wrangler. Now, this Jeep Wrangler, it was hit in the left front. Now, from the pictures, it looked like the whole front end was shifted over quite a bit. It's not that big a deal. I bought a lot of vehicles with that problem. Now, there was a couple of surprises, and I wouldn't find out what those surprises were until I picked it up. So where was this vehicle located? It was located in Memphis, Tennessee, Copart location. So hooked the trailer to the truck and headed that way. Now, when you get to these auctions, it's changed throughout the years. Used to, you would have to go into the actual office, tell them you're there, they bring the vehicle out, load it, that sort of thing. Now everything's pretty much done through the app. You mark arrived, you wait for them to get your vehicle. They let you know they're bringing it out and load you out. Now, I've had some situations where I get to the auction and I'm loaded in 15 or 20 minutes. Sadly, I've had some where I've been there 3 or 4 hours. And you just never know what it's going to be like. Now, at this Copart location in Memphis, one interesting thing is it's by an airport. And so about every 3 to 4 minutes, there's an airplane going over your head, just one right after the other. So at least while you're sitting there, you've got something to look at. Now, it took them about an hour to bring this Wrangler out. I had them set it on the trailer. And this is always a fun moment, but it has a lot of anxiety because you're looking at the vehicle that now you are basically going to rebuild, will be yours. And you got to figure out, okay, what all is wrong with it. So some of the things you can't see when you're at the auction, you got to wait till you get it back to your shop or garage to get it torn down. But on this particular Wrangler, first thing I did was look inside. And I was like, man, this thing looks brand new. Whoever had it kept it clean. There was, I mean, just looked like it was just a detail. Could not be more happy with the inside of the Jeep. So I go to the outside, walk around the back of the Jeep. Everything's in perfect condition. Then I go to the part where it's hit. I look and you can see everything is pushed over. From up top, it doesn't look like anything, major. So I crawl up and under it. And that's when I find the surprise. So the front axle had been shifted over toward the passenger side, and the drive shaft was bent around the bell housing of the transmission. Thankfully, it did not hurt the transmission, but the yoke on the front axle where the drive shaft attached knocked a hole in the upper oil pan on this engine. Then I realized they ran this through the auction as a run drive, which means at the auction they started it, and I don't know how long they let it run. I pulled the pictures back up from the auction, and sure enough, there's a picture of the instrument cluster with the vehicle running and the low oil pressure light on. So at that moment, I didn't know if I was going to have to replace the engine, and that was something I had not planned on. And sadly, I wouldn't know until I got it back to the shop and did a little more work on it. So hopped in the truck and headed back. Now, how many times do you think on that drive back I thought about that hole in that oil pan and wondering how long it had ran with no oil pressure? I called about every mechanic buddy of mine and asked them, how long do you think an engine could run with no oil pressure before it damaged the bearings or something internal? None of their answers made me feel super great, but what else was I to do? So now, on the way back, one thing that broke my train of thought about this engine was I got a flat on the trailer. Sadly, I didn't even know I had a flat until I pulled into a gas station to refuel with diesel. So I changed the tire and made it on back. Now, it's a pretty long day going and getting the Jeep, so I waited a few days before I did my first on-site tear-down inspection. So I unloaded it from the trailer, and given that the front end was pushed over, a lot of the steering was messed up, it was a little difficult to unload by myself. So I had to hook my old Caterpillar forklift to it and basically hook some chains around the front bumper and pick the front of the Jeep up and just slowly let it come off the back of the trailer. Now, when I get it in the shop, now I realize I'm going to have to actually remove the front axle because the first thing I have to do is determine if this engine is damaged or not. So if I'm going to remove the front axle, that means it's not going to roll around anymore. So I'm going to have to, from that point forward, move it with the forklift. But I decided that's really my only option. So I get underneath it and start removing the front axle assembly. Now, once I get the axle assembly out, I realized the second surprise. I was hoping in the wreck that the front frame and the bumper caught most of the impact and pulled everything over to the right. But unfortunately, the axle got drove back into the Jeep toward the firewall just enough that it bent that front axle. Now, those Rubicon axles, they're expensive because they have lockers. But what makes this one even more tricky is most Rubicons have the 4:10 ratio. This particular Rubicon had a 373. So at that point, I've got to add an axle to my parts list. As I mentioned earlier, I don't just go buy auto parts. I go and buy parts Jeeps, buy as many of them as I need to do the repair. But with this oil pan, I ended up having to buy it new. And the reason is I looked at some Jeeps at the auction, but you got to find a Jeep and use the oil pan, you really need one with an engine that's bad, or maybe one that has an engine fire. Well, all those are going to be just absolutely nasty, filthy oil pans. This Jeep had 29,000 miles on it. For it to match, I really needed a nice, shiny oil pan. So looked up, found a guy online, had an OEM one for about 50% of what retail price was for a new OEM upper oil pan. So I ordered it. So changing the oil pan, it was not that difficult. It was pretty easy to get to, especially with the front axle removed. And one thing about nice thing about the Wranglers, a lot of your trucks will have an engine cradle or a piece of a frame, a cross member that goes under the engine and makes it almost impossible to get the oil pan out of there. But these Wranglers, they don't have that under engine frame cross member. So once you get the oil pan unbolted, it comes straight out the bottom, real easy. Once I got the oil pan off, I saw how clean the inside of that engine was. And literally, it looked like an engine with 29,000 miles on it. It looked brand new. So prepared a new oil pan. I was able to reuse my lower oil pan, put it all together, put it back on. So now, put engine oil in it. And now the moment I've kind of been looking forward to, but I've also been dreading. Turn the key on, let the fuel pump prime, and hit the switch. Now, if you know these Jeep Wranglers, they're notorious for timing chain rattle for the first second or so until it builds oil pressure. So I heard that rattle, but then it immediately went away. Then the engine ran like an engine should at 29,000 miles. You talk about load off. To know that I did not have to buy a parts Jeep that had a low mileage engine so I could somehow keep that low mileage theme going through this Jeep. So now they got the engine running, I feel pretty confident that this is going to be a pretty straightforward, just collision repair, replacing bent parts. So when you're doing a repair, first thing you got to do is sit down and make a parts list. So let's start at the front. Now, this Jeep already has some Smitty built front and rear bumpers installed on it, as well as a winch. Now, on the front bumper, it was damaged pretty good, I determined really quickly it was not repairable. Now, the winch had two crossbars that connect the end pieces of the winch. They were snapped in half, but I looked online and those are still available. So the winch could be salvaged. Now, you move back, as I said, front axle, going to have it. Now, these Wranglers have a front sway bar that disconnects. The front sway bar, the outer arm on the driver's side was bent a little bit. So that's an unknown at this moment in the build, if that can be salvaged or not. We got the oil pan on, so that part's done. I won't know if there's any more damage to the engine until I get the body off. Now, I also need a front drive shaft for it, this Rubicon. And the Rubicons take a different drive shaft than your non-Rubicon Wranglers. Now, as far as body parts, obvious. Grille, hood, both fenders, and actually need a right front door as well. The reason being, when the whole front end moved over, it jammed that right front door into the B-pillar and actually buckled it just a little bit, so don't have to have a door. Now, inside, it obviously blew the airbags. And usually when it blows airbags, it locks the seat belts down. So I knew inside I was going to have both airbags, which some vehicles require part of the dash or potentially the whole dash to be changed. So that was unknown at this moment. I need the crash sensors for that airbag system. And then basically after that, all you've got to do is get your airbag module reset. And those airbag modules, when it's in a collision, it records all the crash data. So you can put a new airbag module in it, but then you have to get it programmed with VIN and make sure it communicates to the rest of the Wrangler. In my case, I always just send those out, and there's companies all over the place that will erase the memory. You can put it back in and back on the road. So that's the plan there. Now, the biggest thing that we got to talk about is the frame. Now, some guys like to straighten frames. Some guys will splice a new front frame section on. Now, in my case, I generally just like to start with a straight frame and then kind of rebuild the Wrangler around that straight frame. Now, getting a straight frame in a parts vehicle is a little tricky because it can be wrecked. So it limits you to either one that has some sort of burn, but with burn, you can't get one that's fully burnt because it can warp the frame. You got to get one that has a light engine fire, preferably maybe one that still has the tires on it, and that's an indication that it didn't get so hot that it melted the tires. The other option is flood. The only downside with flood is a lot of electrical components and other things on those Wranglers, especially like the axles, which could use off of that parts Wrangler, could be full of water. So that's a risk there. So you got some other scenarios, but those are your main ones: your flooded or your burnt ones. And I've done both. So now that I've got my parts list, now I've got to go back to the auction and do a bunch of research and try to find the parts Jeeps that I need. All right, so that's all for today's episode as I walk you through rebuilding this Jeep Wrangler. Stay tuned for when we upload the next video. We'll see you then.